Hello, ladies and gentlemen, Gabesty here. This is the Heroic Healer Guide for Thok the Bloodthirsty. And as usual, this video should assist healer players with all the basics they'll need to know to get through this fight on Heroic difficulty. So, let's begin. Now, normally there's no need to discuss raid composition in the role-specific guides. I just do that in the full raid guide. But in this case, this fight is so much about healing that raid composition is important to consider even in this guide. So basically, this fight is the most heal-intensive fight that you're going to face in this entire raid zone by far. It's ridiculously high healing requirements. Because of that, it's really important to consider the strengths of your healers and your raid as a whole, and therefore how you construct your raid based on the number of healers and the type of healers. So there are a few things that are really important to consider, and that's basically the strength or potential strength of certain heal classes in this fight and specs. Probably in order of strength, Resto Shaman and Resto Druid are at the top by far, and the main reason for that is their ground-based healing effects. Efflorescence for Druid, Healing Rains for a Shaman. Because these are smart heals and pretty much constant, they will do the majority of healing on this fight and are very, very effective for the normal phases. Beyond them, the rest of the healers are somewhat difficult to rank since I haven't experienced, priest healing much on this fight. I'm a monk healer, and we also have a holy paladin. So what we generally found is that our druid healer, she was much further ahead of the other healers, and then the paladin and myself were pretty much even with one another, 10 or 15% below her, something like that. So any healer is certainly capable of doing this, but as I said, Druid and Resto Shamans just innately are going to be much stronger at this. So if you have those available, as long as they're geared appropriately, it's really going to help you a lot in meeting the requirement. That said, it's also worth considering how many healers you use. This will depend a great deal on your raid DPS and your ability to use raid cooldowns. If you have a lot of raid cooldowns available, you can get away with fewer healers. We ultimately settled on 3 healers for our raid, and that seemed to be a nice balance with 2 tanks to push the normal phases pretty long, close to the maximum, without sacrificing too much in the way of DPS. Another common strategy that many people use is just to completely overwhelm the healing aspect and go with 4 healers and 2 tanks. This requires that you basically do all your normal phases for the maximum length of time, pretty much to nearly 30 stacks of acceleration on the boss. And it's much easier to do that with 4 healers, of course, but it's important to consider, how you're going to go about it. You can also drop down to 2 healers and just do very brief normal phases, and then try to make up your DPS in your kite phase. This is very difficult to do. You really need a warlock with warlock portals to extend your kite phases and all that stuff. And we don't have that, so I'm not really going to talk about that method. But like I said, I think 3 healers, 2 tanks is the best setup for this. So a few tips for healing the normal phases and dealing with Deafening Screech. And now, one thing you may not be aware of from normal difficulty, just because you weren't required to do so, is that the time between Deafening Screeches actually caps out or becomes as fast as it ever will become pretty quickly into the normal phase. So if you look in the top left there, you can see a little table or chart. What this basically shows is the split times between certain acceleration stacks, certain Screech casts in a phase, and the one prior. So the first Screech occurs about 13.5 seconds from the start of the phase, the normal phase, and then the second Screech occurs about 11 seconds from the first one, and then 7 for the third, 6 for the fourth, 4.8 for the fifth, and so on. What you actually find is that the fastest that Screeches will start to occur hits pretty quickly. After the 6th acceleration stack, Screeches will always, on average, be 2.4 seconds apart, without exception. So from 6 to the max of about 30 stacks of acceleration, that is the maximum DPS that will be incoming to your raid. And that only takes about 45 seconds at the start of the phase to reach that point. So in terms of healing, what this means is that you will need to output your maximum healing that you can once the boss reaches 6 and beyond stacks. It will not go up anymore, but it means that that's going to be the cap point as well. So if you find that you can deal with 6+ stacks with whatever your heal setup is, as long as you can sustain that, you can go from there to 30 or whatever. Now, more likely, you'll need to use cooldowns and whatnot and stagger them. But it's just important to note that that occurs at the 6 stack mark. And from there on, the DPS is the same. So, with that in mind, what we found worked best was to use the first normal phase, so when you initially pull the boss, that phase, and the third normal phase, which is the one in front of this front right cage that you see we're at now. Those two phases are extended the longest. The reason for this is generally because raid cooldowns are too long. Their cooldown themselves, it's too long to actually use it every phase. So you use it on the first one when you initially pull the boss, and then you use them again on the third one. This means that your second normal phase on the front left cage and your fourth normal phase in the back right for the red cage are shortened. And this works out fine. The second one, you're dealing with the bats on this fight on Heroic, so you don't really want that phase to be very long. And then the final one, when there's fire on the ground, you just can't extend it very long because of the fire mechanic. So plan to use your big heal cooldowns or raid cooldowns on the first normal phase and the third normal phase, and those will generally go to 20 or higher stacks for the most part of acceleration. And then the second and the fourth will stop around 15, maybe even 10 for the final one, depending on your survival. So that's the basic idea to sustaining the healing and using your cooldowns appropriately. And of course, the actual rotation you use will be up to your raid makeup and what you have available. But this should work out. So while each normal phase requires quite a bit of healing output, by far the most difficult phase to heal is after you open the green cage, the first cage you're going to open, and the cave bats come out. The reason this phase in particular is very difficult is because the main mechanic that's added after you open the green phase, which is the corrosive blood sort of dot that he places on random players, deals a ton of initial damage when it's applied, as well as pretty heavy damage over time while it's active. It also requires dispels very frequently. So in addition to your normal healing globals, you have to fit in dispel globals. And these occur almost more frequently than you can keep up with. With 3 healers, you can pretty much handle it, but sometimes you need outside dispels from a priest or self-dispels from the players that get targeted and all that stuff. But overall, like I said, this phase in particular is going to be the most difficult for you to deal with as a healer. So the best thing you can do is stay on top of dispels. Have a good system set up with your healing team to dispel the right target to make sure you're not overlapping dispels when possible. Dispel early and often. It will save you not only mana in the long run, but people's lives, because the dot ticks, in addition to the screeches, are enough to end people pretty quickly. Beyond that, make sure you rotate any shorter cooldowns you might have, as well as personal cooldowns on this phase. Make sure your raid members are doing so. Make sure you stun the bats when they come out and they start doing their vampiric bolts attack. If you stun them during this, that'll stop the attack temporarily and save you a lot of damage. Otherwise, it's up to your DPS pretty much to kill the bats quickly. And once the bats are dead or about to die, the raid can stack up and transition the boss. During the kite phase after this, you still have the corrosive blood, so this is another very difficult phase. So again, the best thing you can do is, in addition to having your positions in kite paths worked out well, is to keep up on dispels. If you allow the dots to overwhelm the raid, you're just going to be so far behind that you won't be able to recover during this phase because people will be spread out due to kiting. So it really helps to stay on top of those dispels. That's the best tip I can give for dealing with the green cage. So the normal phase positions are really important for this fight, and I'm not going to go into too much detail about those positions nor the kite paths in this video. If you want a fully animated top-down view of those positions and the paths for kiting, check out the raid link in the bottom left there, the yellow one, and then click on the positions and kiting annotation in the description, and you'll see that entire sequence in action. But I'll briefly cover it here so you kind of know the basics. You can see that the positions we use for the normal phases are indicated by these pairs of markers on either side of the corners of the inner ring here. So you can see in the front left corner near the left cage, we have 2 markers on opposite sides of that corner that are about 12 yards apart. This is where 4 members of the grade on each marker will stack up during the normal phase. And they're within the 12-yard radius of the ground-based heal effects like Healing Rains and Efflorescence, which you can see are constantly up, but also not close enough to one another that they transition the phase too early. And by keeping only 4 people on each marker at any time, your current off-tank that's not on the boss can stand on one of them and not worry about accidentally transitioning the phase, pretty much, because they won't take very much damage. So you have your extra player, since you have 10 people, kind of out opposite the boss pretty much, but not on either of the markers. And these work pretty well. So do 2 sets of 2 markers on each of those corners, and then the boss will be positioned with his side along those markers so that melee DPS can attack the boss while everyone's in those positions. Also, in addition to working really well for the normal phases while you're just standing there, it sets up nicely to enter into the kite pattern that we use here. And again, I won't go into the details of that pattern in this video. It's much too complicated, but you'll have to check out the full raid guide and go to that section if you want to see that in action. So, that really covers everything for the Heroic Healer Guide for Thok the Bloodthirsty. It's a very difficult fight, the most difficult up to this point in Heroic, in my opinion. And really, as a healer, a lot of the success will come down to your ability to sustain that extreme healing per second requirement while maintaining dispels and proper positioning during the kite phases as well. So, good luck, thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed, please subscribe.